Hi friends, welcome to our next session in which we are going to learn the importance of elasticity of demand. In our last session, in our last video, we discussed the factors determining price elasticity of demand, means the factors which determines whether the demand for a product will be relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. Now, we are going to see what is the importance of the concept of price elasticity of demand. The concept of price elasticity of demand is useful to the producers. It is useful to the farmers, it is useful to the workers for determining their wages, as well as it is useful to the government. It has a great importance in economics. Lord Keynes considered this concept to be the most important contribution of Alfred Marshall. According to Keynes, it is a great contribution made by Dr. Alfred Marshall to the economics because of it is useful in various aspects. So, which are these aspects that we are going to learn today? The first importance of the concept of price elasticity of demand is importance to producer. This concept is useful to the producer. For what it is useful? It is useful to the producer to decide the price of his product. He has a problem whether he should charge higher price for his product or lower price for his product. So, how he will solve this problem? While charging price, he will consider the price elasticity of demand for his product. He will consider what? He will consider price elasticity of demand for his product. He will take into account whether the demand for his product is relatively elastic or relatively inelastic. Okay, see, if the demand for his product is relatively elastic, it means relatively more elastic. In such a case, he will have to charge lower price for his product. A slight reduction in price will increase the demand for his product by a larger extent because of the demand for his product is relatively elastic. So, he will charge lower price, slightly lower price for his product if there is a relatively elastic demand. Because of that will lead to increase in demand by a larger extent. So, he will take this decision of charging lower price according to the elasticity of demand. And if suppose the demand for his product is relatively inelastic, what will happen? He will charge higher price for his product. Higher price for his product. What will happen if he is charging higher price? Then the demand will fall down, but not by a larger extent. It will fall down by a smaller extent. In such a way, he can maximize his profit. So, keep it in your mind. A relatively elastic demand, a producer will charge lower price, and a relatively inelastic demand, a producer will charge higher price. So, whether price should be charged higher or lower, this decision will be made according to the elasticity of demand for the product. So in such a way, this concept of price elasticity of demand is useful to the producer. Second one, importance to the government. The concept of price elasticity of demand is important to the government for framing taxation policy. Government also have to face the problem that whether they should charge higher taxes or lower taxes to the product. Tax is one of the important source of income of the government. So in order to maximize their revenue in terms of taxes, tax revenue वाढवण्यासाठी आपला, they will consider the price elasticity of demand for the product. In same way, government will charge high taxes on those goods which are having relatively inelastic demand. Higher taxes on those goods which are having relatively inelastic demand. For example, wine, cigarette, tobacco. These products are taxed more. Washing machines, refrigerator, these are also taxed more. A very high rates of taxes are imposed on luxurious and comfort goods because of these are demanded by rich people. And as we know that the demand made by rich people is relatively inelastic demand. A slight rise in price of such products will not affect their demand by a greater extent. Therefore, the demand for luxurious and comfort goods is relatively inelastic. The demand for wine, liquor, tobacco, cigarette, these are habitual goods. The demand for these goods is also relatively inelastic. So, government will charge higher taxes on these habitual goods as well as on these luxurious and comfort goods. Those people who are badly habituated of consuming tobacco, of consuming cigarette, wine, liquor, they will demand the same quantity of these goods even after rise in their prices. So, higher taxes are imposed on habitual goods as well as on the luxurious and comfort goods. Okay, government earns very larger extent of their revenue by imposing taxes on habitual goods like wine, cigarette. खूप मोठ्या प्रमाणात सरकारला उत्पन्न या माध्यमातून मिळत असतं. त्याच्यामुळं ह्या वस्तूंवरची असणारी जी इलास्टिसिटी आहे ती इनइलास्टिक आहे आणि त्याच्यामुळे त्याच्यावरती टॅक्सेस देखील जास्त असतात. ऑन द ऑपोजिट साइड, if the product has relatively elastic demand, then the government will charge lower taxes on these products. So keep it in your mind, the higher the relatively elastic demand, low taxes. Relatively inelastic demand, higher taxes. Okay, next one. Important in factor pricing. The concept of elasticity of demand is useful in determination of factor prices. This is useful in determination of factor prices. Which are the factors of production? Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. These are the four factors of production. Landowner get income in the form of rent. Labor gets income in the form of wages. Capital owner get income in the form of interest. And entrepreneur gets income in the reward in the form of profit. The reward of entrepreneur is profit. So, the concept of elasticity of demand is useful in determining the rewards of the factors of production, that are land, labor, capital and entrepreneur. Suppose, for example, in case of labor, the demand for labor is relatively inelastic. See, in case of software engineers, the demand for software engineers nowadays is relatively inelastic, and therefore they are earning very high wage rates. Very high wage rates are offered to software engineers. Very high wage rates are offered to CA, chartered accountants, company secretaries. Why? Because of the demand for them is relatively inelastic, and therefore they are earning very higher wage rates. So, the laborers which are having relatively inelastic demand in the market will earn high wage rates in the market, and if the demand for them is relatively elastic, then they will be offered low wage rates. So, elasticity of demand, price elasticity of demand is useful to the workers, to the factor owners for determining their own price. Since the product produced by software engineers is having relatively inelastic demand, they are getting higher wage rates. Is it okay? So, keep it in your mind, the concept of price elasticity of demand is useful to the factor owners for what? For determining their own rewards, for determining their own prices. They will charge higher price for their own service if they knows that the product produced by us is having relatively inelastic demand, and they will charge lower price for themselves if they know that the product produced by them having relatively elastic demand. So, in such a way, the concept of price elasticity of demand is important in making factor prices. Now, another one importance of the price elasticity of demand is importance in foreign trade. There are various aspects related to the foreign trade, like balance of payments. Another one importance of the concept of price elasticity of demand is importance in foreign trade. See, this concept is useful to determine the terms and conditions in foreign trade. This concept is useful in determining the terms and conditions in foreign trade. For example, see here, you can see that Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, that is OPEC. It is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. All countries came together and they have formed their organization. All those countries who produces petroleum products, who produces crude oil, they came together and they form one organization whose name is OPEC. As we know that the demand for crude oil is relatively inelastic, therefore higher prices are charged from OPEC for crude oils in the world. So you can see that if the demand for our product in the international market is relatively inelastic, then you can charge higher price for that. That will be beneficial for our country if there is a relatively inelastic demand for our product in the international market. There is an inelastic demand for tea and coffee produced by us in the international demand, in the international market. Inelastic demand at tea and coffee la. Therefore, we can charge the higher price for tea and coffee which is produced in our country to the neighboring countries. Neighboring countries ला आपण त्याचे जास्तीची प्राइस चार्ज करू शकतो because of it has a relatively inelastic demand. So in such a way, the concept of price elasticity of demand is useful in international trade. The countries exporting commodities for which demand is relatively inelastic can raise their prices. Okay, a country can charge higher price for their product if they are having a relatively inelastic demand, and they will charge lower prices in the international market for their product if they are having relatively elastic demand. Next one, public utilities. Government also takes into account the elasticity of demand for providing certain public utilities. Government provide us electricity, government provide us services of railway, government provide us water. Why? Because of these things are having relatively inelastic demand. Educational services, health services are also provided by government to us. Why? Because of government knows that these are having relatively inelastic demand. People will have to purchase these things at any cost because of these are the necessary things. Water is necessary. If suppose water supply, जर का आपण water supply करण्याचा अधिकार, if the rights of supplying water are given to the private company, then they will charge the higher price for it for making profit. They will exploit the general public, the common man, by charging a higher price. So to avoid this exploitation of common man, government itself supplies water to us. So which products should be produced by ourselves and should be supplied by ourselves to the public? To determine this, to take this decision, the concept of price elasticity of demand is useful to the government. If the demand for product is relatively inelastic, the government will itself produce it and itself supply it to the common man. And if the demand for product is relatively inelastic, then that production of that product will be thrown open for the private sector. So in such a way, the government will take into account the price elasticity of demand for the product for providing public utilities like railways, like electricity, like water supply. So these points explain us the importance of the price elasticity of demand. याच्या अगोदरच्या व्हिडिओमध्ये मी तुम्हाला सांगितलं की इथं बुकमध्ये हा एक 6th पॉइंट आलेला आहे, प्रोपोर्शन ऑफ एक्सपेंडिचर. this point is not related to the importance of price elasticity of demand. This is one of the determinant of price elasticity of demand. Therefore, this point we have explained in our last video. तर एकूण 10 फॅक्टर्स आहेत, डिटर्मिनंट्स आहेत प्राइस इलास्टिसिटी ऑफ डिमांडचे. तो पॉईंट आपल्याला वरती घ्यायचा आहे त्या ठिकाणी. तर अशा पद्धतीनं प्राइस इलास्टिसिटी ऑफ डिमांडचा इम्पॉर्टन्स आपण या ठिकाणी कंप्लीट केलेला आहे. आय थिंक दॅट you have properly understood all these points which explains us importance of price elasticity of demand. Now in this video it is sufficient for us. In the next video we will see the exercise on the price elasticity of demand, and then we will start our next chapter, that is supply analysis. Okay, thank you.